welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today in this video, we are going to discuss about shareholding structure. Many people have asked me in the recent live, and also I have seen many comments asking to do a video on shareholding structure and how to identify UBO, ultimately beneficiary owner. So in this video, we are going to discuss with shareholding structure. As I mentioned you in the previous live, there are some restrictions and limitations to it, because if you want to discuss about some shareholding structure of a private limited entity, so in this video mostly focus on private limited entity. And even though how to do end-to-end KYC for private limited entity, I have done a detailed video on it. As part of that video, in the process of doing conducting KYC of a private limited entity, shareholding structure is also one of the main aspect. We need to identify who is the shareholder of that private limited entity, and then screen those shareholders and also the directors involved in it, and that's how we onboard the private limited entity or that entity. So in order to understand this shareholding structure, in order to onboard the private limited entity, we need to identify first the shareholding structure. It is very important, and due to some limitations I have not explained in that video, because that we want to discuss about private limited entity, we have to take approval from their that specific entity or why we are discussing, and we need to again cross check with the company's house. So because I don't want any details of the customer, because we have a policies called the GDPR, you might have known about it. What the GDPR says that without the consent of the shareholders or without the consent of the private limited entity, we should not be putting that on a open source. So that's why it has taken me a very long time. I've seen like a lot of comments on this particular topic to explain about shareholding structure. So I did some background search how we can better present this, or how we can give an idea about how to tilt on ownership structure, how to frame a shareholding structure. And I made some random examples which will make you clarify the understanding about shareholding structure. So you can just stay with me to the entire video, so you'll understand how we have to proceed with the shareholding structure and drill down of the ownership structure. And before we go into the next slide, I would like request everyone to, if you feel this video is very helpful, do like this video and comment your opinion. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do subscribe. Because producing these kind of videos take a lot of time and effort. So your the way you subscribe and also like will boost me to do more videos, because they have some lot of restrictions on it, because you might have already known about GDPR principles, or also the customers data, how we use customer data. So I made a lot of efforts to bring examples to give you a clear understanding about shareholding structure. And I also tell you, like, if you are applying for a KYC interview, what happened pre COVID. Pre COVID, the first round will be normal HR round, and then the AVP or the team leader just might ask you about the basics of KYC and how to check whether you have knowledge in or not. And later that round, there will be assessment round where you will be asked to drill down the ownership structure. They will be sending a document, and you have to analyze the document, you have to drill down it, and you have to write it. But after COVID and the recent times, the situation got completely changed. They are not giving the assessment. They are just sharing their screen and giving you 5 minutes or 10 minutes of time, and asking you to identify the ultimate beneficiary owner. So at that time, you can't seek help from others. You have to understand the concept, and you need to identify the shareholders in front of the interviewer, or in front by seeing your screen. So that's how, like, this plays very important in the interview also. Like, previously the scenario is different, now the competition has become very tough. They're asking about multiples of scenarios. They'll give random scenarios and ask you explain what would you do in this situation, how do you identify the UBO, and what is the IBO, intermediary beneficiary owner or initial beneficiary owner. So the multiples of cross questions, because the competition has been increased in the KYC AML field. So they expect more potentiality in the knowledge and also the process wise. And later part, maybe in the next video, I'm going to explain about the recent interview questions, how tough is that. Many of my colleagues are attending. Even I have also attended a few interviews. So how tough the mainly what are the recruiters are focusing, I'll be sharing in the next video. Please to stay tuned to these videos because the hiring season have just started. Okay, when it comes to the shareholding structure, before we discuss about shareholding structure, we need to know about two terminologies. One is a natural person and one is an artificial person. So natural person will always be an individual. That's a very important point because these questions can be asked in the interview as well. What do you mean by natural person? So natural person will always be an individual. And artificial person can be an individual or entity or anything that comes. So natural person is always an individual. So why I am saying natural person is an individual, because natural person is the one who is UBO, ultimately beneficiary owner. So the any entity, take any entity, private limited, or take some example of trust or maybe or charity, the ultimate beneficiary owner should be an individual, because a entity or a firm cannot be the ultimate beneficiary owner. Okay, because they cannot get the benefits of the private limited entity. So the ultimate beneficiary owner should always be an individual. So that there is an individual. That individual is called a natural person. So a UBO should always be a natural person, which means a UBO should always be an individual. So that the key differences between the natural person and artificial person. That's where our KYC starts. So I'll give brief examples about it, and before you understand why we are drilling down the ownership structure, why we are identifying the shareholding structure, why we are identifying who the shareholders, I request you to go to the video, end-to-end KYC on private limited entity, and then you can check this video. Then you get the idea about it, why the shareholders are important, why we are drilling down the, why we are identifying the shareholders. So I bought one random example. This is a very simple example. There are three levels in this example. One is the basic level, next one is the intermediate level, and third one is advanced level. And third one is advanced level is optional, but in real scenarios, the mostly the third scenario comes into picture. These are just the basic examples to give you oral understanding. Okay, you have seen here, shareholding structure. We have two types of shareholding structure: simple shareholding structure and complex shareholding structure. So simple shareholding structure is nothing but there will be only one layer. So if you see in this example, client is XYZ Limited, and the shareholders are Alice, Bob, and Charlie. They share a percentage of 50%, 30%, and 20%. So this is a simple shareholding structure because we only have the one layer, which means this is the one layer. So this is called simple shareholding structure. So XYZ Limited is a private limited entity where it was XYZ is held by the shareholders of XYZ are LS. He holds 50% of stake in XYZ Limited, and BOB holds 30% of stake in XYZ Limited, and Charlie holds 20% of the XYZ Limited. So how do we get this information? Initially, the relationship manager will give this information in the case or alert you're working on. So now, since the relationship manager gives us this, we can simply go and take this into consideration. No, we should not take this into consideration. Since the relationship manager gives us this information, we have to cross verify with the company's house. So how do we cross verify with the company's house? I'll give an example how you can cross verify with the company's house. And this is just an example, so you might not find this company in the company's house, but I'll give an example how you can cross check with the company's house. We check in the company's house. This is an example. Again, don't compare that ABC Limited or XYZ Limited with this limited, because as I mentioned you, we should not discuss about the shareholding structure in an open source. So I have taken that example. But how do we know? How do we know that relationship manager has given the correct information or not? So whatever the relationship manager, the company name, the relationship manager gives, we come and search here. So well, in this case, we assume that this is Atlantic Limited. So we just come to this is a company's house. It is easily available. You can just type it and you can press the enter here. We'll get the details of many. So we'll assume that this is our company. And you can also check with the company number, because if Atlantic Limited is our company, we have the details of the company registration number and address. So with the registration number also you can check. So once we assume this is Atlantic Limited, now we need to check about here. company overview. Company status is active, so then so we can proceed it. If the status is like disabled or inactive, we have to get back to the relationship manager and ask for the company status is inactive. How do we proceed now? Okay, because we don't onboard the clients which are like inactive state. And we have to we'll check the cross verify the address also, because the address given in the relationship manager and a company so should exactly match. Because while screening of the company, we need to input this address in the LexisNexis. So that's why address plays very important. So I'll tell you one very important thing while we are doing about any KYC of any, let it be individual or entity. Each and every minute detail counts. If you have any discrepancy between the single word also, you can get back to relationship manager asking for the why there is a discrepancy. For example, you see here this was a registered address, and for suppose a relationship manager given has entire address, and somewhere instead of 10 it is 11. So there is a discrepancy, so we have to get back to the RM and ask for the why there is a discrepancy and ask for the correct register address. So because we are onboarding it, that's the where we are giving them entry into our bank, so we have to be very careful. So overview, all these overview relationship manager will already gives in the case, but we need to cross verify the company source. Company source, this was the official website of UK government, so we need to cross verify each and every statement. So now once we cross verify each and everything, we need to check with the shareholding structure. As I mentioned you, the relationship manager gives us this shareholding structure. We should again cross verify whether this shareholding structure is correct or not. How do we verify it? Just go to company's house and check for the address and nature of business, and check for the any previous names, and come to the filing history. If we come to the filing history and check for the latest statements of financial statements, if you see a change of details of Atlantic Family Holdings Limited as persons with significant control, and you can see here confirmation statement. Confirmation statement is nothing but financial statements. So we have to check this statement because this was the latest available. If you see here, there is no other top of it. You can find confirmation statement with no updates, which means there are no updates when compared to the previous one. So this was the latest, so we'll take this. And if you see here the company name Atlantic Limited, or the company name and everything will be there. And here the statement of capital, number of shares allotted for. So if you come here, see full details of the shareholders. So which means these are the shareholders. They mention one ordinary share held as the date of this confirmation statement by Christopher John Neal, and one with John N.L. Neal. One transferred to Anthony, one transferred on zero ordinary shares. So Anthony is holding zero, and one transferred again zero ordinary shares held at Susan, so he is holding zero, and two ordinary shares held at the data confirmation Atlantic Family Holdings Limited. So in this case it clearly says four shares are there, two are held by Atlantic and one is held by the individual and one is held by individual. So if you split 100 into 4, it comes as 25%. So which means now 50% is owned by Atlantic Family Limited, and 25% is owned by John Hill, and 25% is owned by Christopher John Will. This is how we have to manually calculate it and cross check with the information given by the relationship manager. If the somewhere we get a discrepancy, we have to get back to her and ask for the explanation why there is a discrepancy. All right. So that's how we have to cross verify how the data given by the relationship manager and the company's house is the matching or not. Now again we'll get back to our one example. I request you to make a little focus, because I have made three examples. All three examples are very important, and it gives in each and every level the basic, intermediate, and advanced level. So this was the XYZ Limited is a private limited entity, and all the shareholding structure here we are discussing about private limited entity. So private limited entity is 100% because the entity has entire shares with the XYZ Limited. As I mentioned, the ultimate beneficiary owner should always be a natural person, which means an individual. So in this case, these three will become the natural persons. So XYZ Limited shareholders or LIS 50%, Bob 30%, Charlie 20%. Now, how do we drill down the ownership structure? This is simple drill down of ownership structure. It looks like this. So XYZ Limited 100% shareholding, and in this 100%, LS hold 50%, and Bob holds 30%, Charlie holds 20%. So and we have a rule who is the ultimately beneficiary owner, and here all the three are ultimately beneficiary owners. And we take that shareholding structure. We have threshold limit who can be called as ultimately beneficiary owner. For example, XYZ Limited is a low risk entity. And how do we know whether it is a low risk, medium risk, or high risk? Based on the four factors, which I have already explained in the previous video. The four risk factors, how risk can be assessed in a bank or financial institution. So, based on the four risk factors, we got to know that XYZ Limited is a low risk. And for low risk, the threshold limit to be a ultimately beneficiary owner is 25% or more. So, in this case, LS holds 50%, Bob holds 30%, Charlie holds 20%. So, well, in this case, only LS and Bob will become the ultimately beneficiary owners, not Charlie, because Charlie percentage is 20%, and we have threshold limit for low risk 25%. Any shareholder who holds 25% or more shareholding in any entity, those are called ultimately beneficiary owners. So, well, in this case, both LS and Bob will become the ultimately beneficiary owners. I hope this is a basic example I made you to understand, because going forward we'll enter into a big size example. Okay. Now same again. This is a little bit of advanced level, no advanced advanced level, like next level, intermediate level. So here the client is XYZ Limited, equal shareholding. Sometimes the relationship manager, she doesn't give the percentage, she gives the equal shareholding structure. And sometimes they also give us ratio 1:1:1, which means equal ratio. So now how do we do this? So our client is XYZ Limited, equal shareholding structure, and the equal shareholding structure, and the shareholders are Mark, Elise, and James. So this is how it looks like. The XYZ Limited is 100%. The XYZ Limited is 100%, and Mark holds 33.3, Elise holds 33.3, and James holds 33.3. Well, in this case, let us example XYZ Limited is also a low risk country, and as we have the threshold 25% or more, any shareholder who holds 25% or more in an entity, he will be termed as a UBO, ultimately beneficiary owner. So well, in this case, all the three individuals will become the UBOs, ultimately beneficiary owners. So these are the two simple examples. Next will be the advanced level, like similar. It is like drilling down the share. These percentage you have to drill down manually. There won't be any softwares. Maybe some advanced relationship tree. We call it as a relationship tree. Just if you input the person to the names, it automatically calculates. But in the interview, I don't think you have that option to use those tools and all. But manually, many organizations they ask you to drill down the ownership structure manually. So this is a little bit of max. So moving into the complex shareholding structure, where I say simple shareholding structure is nothing but one layer. If you see here, there is only one layer. Under complex shareholding structure, we involve multiples of layers. That is called complex shareholding structure. It is also called as multi-layer shareholding structure or complex shareholding structure. Shareholding structure and complex shareholding structure is that layers, the number of layer the shareholders has. For example, if you see here, there is only one layer of it, the Mark, Ellis, and James. This is only one layer, so it is called simple shareholding structure. But in complex, we have multiple layers. Let it be two layers, three layers, or four layers. So this is a complex shareholding. That is the difference between the simple shareholding structure and complex shareholding structure. Complex shareholding structure is also called as multi-layer shareholding structure because it has multiples of layers. We'll see with the example. So this was the example ABC Private Limited. When we say, if you observe here, it is ABC Private Limited. Here I just mentioned as ABC Limited. So in general, ABC Limited is nothing but ABC Private Limited. They use it as a very short. Whenever there is a just a limited, it is nothing but the private limited entity. So when we see here, the client has given, the client in the sense the relationship manager or the bank has given, this was the structure they give. And ABC Limited is 100% owned by XYZ Limited, and again XYZ Limited is owned by three shareholders, James, David, and Mark. So now how do we identify UBO, ultimately beneficiary owner? As I mentioned, UBO should always be a natural person. So in this case, you can easily identify it. James, David, and Mark are three natural persons, so they can be UBO. But how do we drill down the ownership structure? So it is very simple. You just need, so this is how you have to drill down the ownership structure. So in the clearly they gave in the case ABC Limited, obviously it will be 100%, and again this is 100% owned by XYZ Limited, and now XYZ Limited is 25% owned by Mark, 25% owned by David, and 50% by James. So if you see the percentage 25, 25, 50. So in this case, let us assume ABC, the risk of ABC is high risk. Okay, let us assume the risk of ABC is high risk. For high risk, the threshold limit is 10% or more. So, for any entity who is having the risk of high, the threshold limit is 10% or more. So, for low risk and medium, it is 25% or more, and for high risk entities, the risk rating or the threshold limit of shareholding structure is 10%. So any shareholder who holds 10% or more can be considered as a UBO, ultimately beneficiary owner. So well, in this case, all the three are holding more than 10%. So which means these three will become the UBOs of ABC Limited. So now once we identify the ultimately beneficiary owners, now in this case, this XYZ will become the IBO, initial beneficiary owner or intermediary beneficiary owner. So but ultimate beneficiary owner is these three. So that is the difference between the initial beneficiary owner or intermediary beneficiary owner and also ultimately beneficiary owner. Now these are all the classic examples where you never get in the process. Very rarely you will get these scenarios, but in the process what you will get mostly, because the real life scenarios what you get. I'll give you a case, just go through that case and just analyze it, because as I mentioned, this drill running of the ownership structure is nothing but maths. If you are very good at maths and if you understand the logic behind it, you can easily drill down the ownership structure. So now, as I mentioned in the video, while we are while we are doing this client onboarding, why we have to identify the shareholders, because shareholders have the voting rights or they have the influential power. So we need to identify the shareholders and screen them against web adverse media and sanctions. That is the main reason, because shareholders take the decision which impacts the entire entity. So now if you screen, if they like what the bank perspectives, if the shareholders are clean, the entity will be clean. So that's why we identify the shareholders, we identify the ultimately beneficiary owners. As I mentioned, beneficiary owners, ultimate beneficiary owners, which means they are the ones who take decisions in the entity. So once you identify the ultimately beneficiary owners, we screen them against perp adverse media on sanctions. If they are free from these three, then we onboard the entity. And along with these shareholders, we also identify directors, and we also screen them against perp adverse media on sanctions, and then we onboard them. This is all the classic examples, but in reality, these won't be these examples. You can't see these examples. Mostly, you can't see. This is what the real example which I am going to show you. So this was the real example. This is how an exact case looks like. The KYC case looks like. So I'll just read it and I'll clearly explain you. Just follow me along with this. So they given the case, because mostly in the interviews they'll give you these type of case studies and they'll ask you to identify. They'll give you hardly 10 minutes of time, and you have to take a pen and a paper and you have to drill down the ownership structure like we have done before, and you need to identify the ultimately beneficiary owner. Okay, this is what now the present trend is going on. They're not giving you an assessment and asking you to work on it and submit it in within 24 hours. That's not going to happen now, because they'll directly share your screen just like this, and I'll ask you to identify the shareholders, identify the UBO, identify the IBO. No. So when it comes to this case, please use the following information to draft an ownership structure chart and calculate effective ownership of all BOs. BOs nothing but beneficiary owners. They clearly mention to draft a ownership structure chart, so you should not use any softwares and all, and calculate the effective ownership structure of all BOs. BOs are nothing but beneficiary owners. Both direct and indirect calculations to be shown. I'll tell you what is direct and what is indirect. And if you see here, they are given 10% drill down, which means this is high risk entity. Okay, 10% drill down is nothing but it is high risk entity. So the entity name is Alpha Corporation is high risk. So the client itself has given high risk. Even though if the client doesn't give it as high risk, we need to assume this is high risk based on the percentage they give. So this is about the case. Alpha Corporation is directly owned by three entities. So James INT Incorporation with the 20% shares, and Samsung PLC. You have to remember PLC. PLC is nothing but Public Limited Company with 20% of shares, and Olive Group Corporation with 20% with 60% of shares. And again, they mentioned that James INT Incorporation is owned by 50% by John Smith and 50% by Jane Smith, and the remaining 75% of shares are in the passionate are in the possession of Latex BV. And Samsung PLC is a company listed in the stock exchange. So here the lucky part is they gave Samsung PLC. PLC, as I mentioned, public limited company, which means the shares will be held by the public, which also can be termed as it is listed in the stock exchange. Is a company listed on the stock exchange. Olive Group Corporation is 100% owned by Latex BV, and Latex BV is 80% owned by AA and 20% by Michael Smith. AA Incorporation is listed on the exchange with Michael Smith owning 20% of the shares. No other entity or individual is holding more than 5% of its shares. So this was the case. This is the actual case which you have to work once you put into the production. Okay, now we'll break down each and everything and we'll discuss about it how you have to drill down the ownership structure for this. So if you break each and everything, okay, we start from the alpha because this was our entity. It is a high risk entity. They mentioned Alpha Corporation is directly owned by three entities. So first we take that Alpha Corporation directly owned by three entities: James INT, Samsung PLC, Olive Group. So 20 20 60. So when you add up these, you will get 100%, right? 100%. We need to follow up the percentage. We have to cross check anytime the percentage here is a matching or not. So 60 plus 20, 80, 80 plus 20, 100%. So now that it was a tally. Now again discuss about James INT Incorporation. They mentioned James INT Incorporation is held by John Smith, Jane Smith, and Latex Baby. 15%, 15%, 70%. So we have seen in the case they mentioned about both the direct and indirect calculation to be shown. So you have to display it while we are doing it. What is direct and what is indirect. So here it becomes a direct because whatever the client gives that becomes a direct. And if you see here, James INT Incorporation 20%, and again this 20% is owned by John Smith 15%. So now 20% of 15%, 15% of how much it becomes 3%, and these three becomes the indirect percentage. I think like you might get confused. Again, I'll explain in detail because it is all about basic maths. Okay. Direct ownership alpha is obviously it will be 100%. This 100% is split among three people, 20%, 20%, 60%. There 100 it gets matched. Now again we take about James he holds 20%. And how this 20% is split, if you see here, 14 plus 3 17, 17 plus 3 20, and this 20 is matching, which means this 20 is again divided into these three people in the ratio of 15%, 15%, 70%. Now we need to get 20%. How do we get 20? 14 plus 3 17, 17 plus 3 20. Okay, now we got the James INT shareholding structure. Now we have to see the Samsung PLC. Samsung PLC, it is a public limited entity, which means there are no shareholders. Let us assume you might have seen any entity which is listed in the stock exchange. There you get lot of shareholders. So it will be very uh, it will be very difficult to identify all those shareholders and put it in screening, and that takes a very lot of time, and it is not even possible because the stock either the entity is listed in the stock exchange, which means that trades gets traded every single minute the shareholders will change, because once he sold the shares he won't become the shareholder of this entity, and who is going to buy that shares he will become the shareholder. So it is very hard to track. So they say that for PLC, public limited entity, because it is a stock listed entity, there are no UBOs, which means there are no shareholders. And how do we assess the risk? Because it is listed on the stock exchange, which means it is being regulated by the regulatories, so the risk will be very low. So we don't drill down further. We just mention Samsung PLC, it is a stock listed on stock exchange, so there are no UBOs, and we'll close it there. Now we'll discuss about Olive Grip 60%. See, they clearly mentioned Samsung PLC is a publicly traded, which means publicly listed on the stock exchange. So no individual is assumed to have significant control. That is true. And left with the Olive Group. On Olive Group, they mentioned as 100% owned by 100% owned by Latex BV, which is called again 60%. Here you might get confused, so I'll explain in detail in the next slide. And drilled on ownership structure of the Latex BV. Again, Latex BV is held by AA Incorporation 80%, Michael Smith 20%. Here, if you see here 60%, and again 60% of Latex BV is held by these two people. So I suggest to, whenever you get these kind of complex cases, as it is a basics max, you take a paper, you take a pen, and you drill down on your own. So it will be easy for you, instead of no like no calculating in the air. Okay, 50, 50, 50. It won't give you correct information. At least in the initial stages, you have to practice on a paper. And again, so ultimately these people you'll get anyway, you'll get definitely confused if I just show in the air like this. Okay, 20%, 20%. So I have made again clearly drill down the ownership structure, so it will be easily understood. So this is how confusion. So I made it with pen and paper again to make it very clear understanding on this. So we'll see what exact how you have to drill down it. This is the actual structure that it looks like Alpha Corporation, but I suggest you to take a pen and paper and draw the drill down structure, because this is a basic match. So this is how it looks like Alpha Corporation. Alpha Corporation 100%, it is owned by three entities. James INT 20%, Samsung PLC 20%, Olive Grip 60%. So if you sum up these, you have to get 100%. 60 plus 20 plus 20, 100%. And again, what this is in the case, James INT, which means James INT, now the shareholding of James INT is only 20%. But they mentioning that again, these 20 is held by three people: John Smith, Jane Smith, and Latex BV. Okay, these are the three entities with James INT is holding. So in this 20%, how this 20 is divided? 15, 15, and 70. Again, if we add this, it will be 100%. Because we need to get 20, right? So 20% is again, this 20% is again held by these three people in what ratio? 15, 15, and 70. So now this become the direct percentage, and 15% they mentioned this become a direct percentage, and these three becomes indirect percentage. So now 20% they mentioned. In this 20%, in this 20, just make it as a 20. In this 20, 15% is held by John Smith, so which means 20 into 15%, 3%. In the same way, Jane Smith holds 15% in this 20. In this 20, so we make it as 20 into 15%, which is 3%. In the same way, in this 20, the latex BV, this one, that the latex BV is holding 70%, which means 20 into 70, 14%. All right. So now latex BV is holding 14%. Now I can come back, and Samsung PLC 20%. Here there is no other arrow, which means it is a PLC. There won't be any individual. There won't be any shareholders, which means no UBO, no individual is having significant control. So we leave this here. Now again they mentioned as Olive Group. Olive Group holds 60%, and in this 60, how they divided? In this 60%, 100%, 60%, the entire 60% is held by latex BV. So how do we say that? 60 into 100%, which means 60% again. So which means this entire 60 is again held by latex BV. Now ultimately, how much latex BV is holding from James Smith, from James INT, it is holding 14%, and from Olive Group it is holding 60%. Now ultimately, how much latex BV is holding? 74%, which means 14% here and 60% here, which is called 74%. This was the, now we come to a conclusion that okay, latex BV is holding 74%. Now again, what they have mentioned, latex BV 75% is again held by AA Incorporation 80%. 74 into 80, which comes somewhere around 59.2. If they mention 80 here, the leftover will be 20. The 20 is held by Michael Smith. Again, 74 into 20, which is called 14.8%. These 20%, 80% will become the direct percentage or direct ratio, and this which we derived, it is called indirect percentage. Okay. Now AA Incorporation is holding 59.27, and Michael Smith is holding 14.8%. And again they mentioned AA is listed in the stock exchange with 80% with the stock exchange and 20% with the Michael Smith. Again, this person is handling 20% in this 59.2. So 15.9.2 in 20%, which becomes 11.84. Now, if you see the ultimately beneficiary owners, you will get a clear picture. As I mentioned, the ultimately beneficiary owner will always be natural person. So here in this case, the natural person is John Smith, Jane Smith, Michael Smith, and Michael Smith, he has now holdings in two here. Here he is holding 14.8. Here he is holding 11.84. So total 11.84 plus 14.8, 26.6%. So now these three will become the shareholders, and ultimately UBO, ultimately shareholder will become the only Michael Smith, because he is holding 26.6% and they are holding just 3%. They mentioned as a high risk entity. For high risk entity, the threshold limit is 10% or more. So well, in this case, Michael Smith will become the ultimately beneficiary owner with the 26.6 percentage. It is a basic max. Like you can take this as a screenshot, or you can take this as a case. I'll give this case, you just copy this case and practice, take this case and practice yourself. Because if you want to take this case, I'll give you the case ID. This is an exact case. You can just take a screenshot and put on a paper, practice it, and I can cross verify with the percentages given here at the end. You will understand it. You can keep practicing it, how you have derived it and all. So you will get a clear picture of very understanding. You'll get a very clear picture of how you have to drill down the ownership structure. So ultimately he's holding 26.6%. That's all about shareholding structure and drilling down the ownership structure. Wherever you go, any organization, the same thing, it will repeat it, because this is the basic standard structure, and this involves the basic max. And I thought you got a clear picture now. So just keep practicing it, and even though you, after this video, if you have any doubts, you can ping down in the comment section. I'll help you with an upcoming videos, or if you want, if that requires any additional in detail, I'll do one more video on it. And please do mention in the comment section how do you feel about this video. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the next video.